Good morning, church. I've got my water this morning because I've got a bit of man flu. That was actually more sympathy than I was expecting, to be honest. It's week 4. The sympathy in my household is waning, let's put it that way. No, it's really good to be with you. It's great to be able to share some thoughts from the Bible this morning. And if you've been with us over the last few weeks, you'll know that throughout March we're unpacking some of the harder questions in the Christian faith. I'm not sure who came up with that as a preaching topic. I'd rather answer some of the easier questions of the Christian faith, because none of us like hard questions, do we? And we deal with a lot of them in our house at the moment because we have a 3.5-year-old. So there's a lot of questions day by day, and we were in the car a few weeks ago driving to see some friends, and Millie, my daughter, said out of nowhere, "Mummy, how are clouds made?" And now my wife's quite a smart lady. If you've met her, you'll know she went to one of the best business schools in Canada, and she was a A-grade student the whole way through school and university. So I really enjoyed the panic in her voice as she tried to formulate an answer to this question. And she was doing that thing where you're trying to stall and buy time whilst Googling the answer. She was like, "Oh, Millie, that's a great question. Where do you think clouds come from?" "Oh, let's have a think, shall we?" Then she had the phone. She was like, "Oh, yeah, well I think, just from memory, I think that it's when there's too much vapor in the air. And, the air can't hold all of the vapor. And so then it forms tiny water droplets. Can you believe that? And those tiny droplets are so small, they just say suspended in the air." And Millie was like, "Oh, right, okay, fair enough." But yeah, none of us like hard questions. We don't like being put in a place where we have to answer hard questions. And I think as Christians, we have to accept this is something we're going to always have to deal with. And so if you're here today and you have a faith, I think it's great to kind of be equipped with some of the understanding of how to tackle hard questions. And if you're here today and you're exploring faith, or you're listening online and you're exploring faith, then hopefully we can just unpack something for you this morning and give you a slightly different perspective on what is, at face value, a pretty tough question. And over the last few weeks, Marcus looked at the question, is the Bible still relevant? Beth then had the daunting task last week of looking at the topic, why do we suffer? And today we're looking at the question, why is it important how we live? Why is it important that we live in accordance of the things that God calls us to do? And from many conversations I've had with friends over the years that aren't Christians, I think this is a question that a lot of them have struggled with. And I understand why, because I think on the one hand, it feels like there's a paradox that we have to deal with in the Bible. There's like a conflict between some of the data that we get. So Beth talked last week about creation and Genesis and Adam and Eve as part of what she said. And in Genesis, we learn that God created man. God created mankind. And God created man with the ability to fail, this innate ability to fail. And as we saw with Adam and Eve last week, they disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, and that started the snowball effect of sin, wrongdoing, entering the world. But we learn from the Bible God created us that way. And what we then learn from the Bible is that mankind has spent century on century since that point trying to live at a level that God has asked them to, and unable to do so. And we learn that not a single man or woman since the creation of the earth, apart from Jesus when he was man for a time, have managed to live without blame. We then learn that God sent his son Jesus. He sent a very part of himself to conquer this problem that mankind was dealing with, to conquer sin forever, to die on a cross, to take on all of that and to conquer it for eternity, even while we were still sinners, it says in Romans 5 verse 8. And then 2 verses later in 5 verse 10, it says that now, even still as imperfect people, because of that cost that Jesus paid, we are reconciled, we are reconnected to God, and we get relationship with him. And that is essentially the gospel message there in a nutshell. Mankind had this problem that was too big for it to deal with, and so God sent Jesus, a part of himself, to reconcile us. And if you're hearing that for the first time today, let me tell you, that is the best news you could ever hear. That God loves you so much, that God sees your imperfections, from the tiny character flaws to the huge imperfections in you, and wanted relationship with you so much that he sent his son to die on a cross for you. That is the best news you could possibly ever hear, and we're going to come back to that at the end. But before we get there, I think there is a big question to answer in all of that. And it's a long question, to be honest, but it's the question of, if God created us that way, if he created us with this innate ability to fail, if he recognized that there was a problem too big for us to deal with and then sent his son to die and to pay the price for that sin, if now because of that death we are reconciled and reconnected to God, then why does it really matter how we live now? Why does God still ask things of us? Why do we have the Ten Commandments? Why do we have a Bible full of instruction and guidance on how we should live our life? If he's recognized and even created us that way and has already found the antidote and provided it for us, why does it matter? And I think it's a really good question. And I think back to some conversations I had with friends at school, and they really struggled with this concept because they were like, so you're telling me you're imperfect and you mess up all the time, and God forgives you when you mess up, if you're truly sorry for it. And then you start again the next day and you mess up and you go through the whole cycle again. And they were like, isn't that just a lot of spiritual admin that you just don't need when you're telling me the price has already been paid? And there's a lot of sense in that as a conversation. But I think for me, the problem with it is that when people really struggle to understand that dynamic, it's because there's a worldview out there that's quite cynical about God. And I think a lot of us, probably at some point in our lives, have dealt with cynical questions about God. Like, is he just a narcissistic God who created a set of guidelines for us to live by, but created us in a way that we would never be able to meet those guidelines? And does he just enjoy watching us struggle to make that grade and mess up all the time? I honestly believe a huge part of secular world feel that way about God. I think if that's the kind of God that you guys worship, I don't want anything to do with him. And I want to call out this morning, that is a misconception. It's a huge misconception of the character of God that we get if we actually read through the Bible and we take the time to understand it. And what I want to do this morning is just challenge that perception by looking at some verses in the Old Testament book of Proverbs. We're going to read from Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 12. And Proverbs was a book written by, we believe, King Solomon, who was known as the wise king. So the words should come up behind me, but I'll read them out. So it says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, and then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those who he loves. As a father, a son, he delights in. And so we're just going to cover quickly 3 reasons why I think it is important that we live, or strive to live, in the way that God has called us to. And the first one is that when we choose to live that way, and we choose to accept that guidance from God, what we're doing is we're acknowledging that in our lives we need guidance from a wiser source than our own. And the first part of that verse says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. And whether we like it or not, in every area of our life, we live under a set of rules. We have a government who are responsible for dictating the way that we live, the way that we treat each other in a corporate sense. And whether we like our government or we don't, we can probably all accept that most of the decisions they make, most of the laws that they bring into place, are there with the intention to make the world that we live a better place, a safer place, universally, even if they don't always get it right. And so in our everyday secular world, for want of a better word, we accept that someone has authority and is able to dictate the way that we live to a degree. We're not allowed to kill each other, which is really good news. We're not allowed to burn each other's houses down. We're not allowed to defraud each other and take each other's identities. These things, I'm sure we can all accept, are largely good things. And that is something that's just natural for us in secular world. But I think sometimes when it comes to faith, this idea that there might be laws gives people an allergic reaction. I've heard people say it. I heard them say, well, look, I'd be really interested in getting to know Jesus if he didn't have all these rules I had to follow. I'd be really interested in going to church if there weren't things that I have to do. And I find it quite amusing because I literally think every other area of our life, we accept that dynamic. So, we accept that the health guru on Instagram might be able to tell us something about ourselves that we don't know. in terms of what's good for us and what's not good for us in a nutritional sense. When we go to work, we accept that our boss has a level of authority over us, and they have an authority in that environment and a wisdom in that environment to make rules and guidelines that we're needing to follow. If we go to school or university, we will accept that our lecturers or our teachers have a degree of authority in that space and are better positioned to decide what the code of conduct should be for us on that course. But when it comes to faith and it comes to Jesus, sometimes people just don't like that dynamic. It makes them uncomfortable that there's an expectation there. But I think the first thing we've got to understand is that when we come to a place of humility where we go, actually, God, you've given me good guidance and I'm going to strive to live in accordance with that guidance, we're just accepting that someone with far greater wisdom than us in that area of our life is giving us advice and good counsel on how to live. And that's a really sensible place to start. The second thing that I wanted to stress this morning is that it's really important we live in accordance to God's laws, because when we do that, our lives get better. Our lives don't get worse when we follow the laws and the instructions of God. And again, I think that is a worldly view. It's that actually if I do the things that the Bible tells me I have to do, my life is restricted. My life gets worse. And I just don't believe that's true. That next part of the proverb says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, and then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." And at face value, that part of the proverb is talking about the physical things we have. It's talking about a long-standing biblical principle that we take the first and the best of the things God has blessed us with, and we give it back to him in a financial sense or in the sense of the physical that we own. And by the way, that's a classic piece of biblical teaching that not a lot of people like. It's like, actually, I'd really like to get to know Jesus, but if I have to do anything with my money, no, don't like that bit. If I have to trust him with the things I have, no, I'm not so keen on that. That's a really classic example. I'd really love to go to church, but they keep talking about tithing, and I hate it when they do that, so I'm not going to go there anymore. And at a primary sense, that's what the proverb's talking about. It's like a physical and it's a wealth thing. But I think there's a secondary element to that proverb, which isn't just that in the financial, when we honour God, we are far more secure in our futures. But it's actually like when we honour him with all the things he asks us to do, with all the guidance that he gives us, when we honour him and we try and live that way, our entire future is more secure. Again, because someone wiser than us has dictated that is a great way to live. And when we look at the instructions, and let's look at the Ten Commandments as an example, like when we follow those, our lives don't get worse, they get better. So if we decide we're going to murder someone, we end up in jail and our life gets worse. If we decide to commit adultery, we risk losing something precious from our life in the form of our marriage. Our life generally gets worse, not better. And even in the small things. So there's a test, one of the commandments is about coveting. It's about not looking at things that other people have and allowing your heart to get jealous of those things and to become obsessed with those things. When we lie, when we deceive, when we steal, when we do all of these things, there is a knock-on effect that makes our life worse. There's guilt associated, there's shame associated. These things don't take us towards a place of happiness, they take us away from a place of happiness. And Jesus said in John 10, I believe, from memory, he said that he came not just to give us life, but he came to give us life in abundance. So the things that God instructs us to do, they're not just to give us a base level of life quality. They're to give us life in abundance, life in full. And all of those things we've just talked about, if we go against the word of God, our life doesn't get more full, it gets less full. And I know from personal experience that whenever in my life I have decided to wander away from the instruction of God, the next season of my life has not been a fuller season. It's been a less full season. And that is because there is huge wisdom in what God asks of us. And then the final reason that I think it's really important we live in a way that God instructs us to is that his discipline is absolutely essential for us. The discipline of God is essential for our progress. I talked earlier on about that kind of cynical view of God, that he just likes to watch us jump through hoops, set us a bar that we can't ever meet. And this next bit of the proverb, this final bit of the passage that we are looking at this morning, gives a totally different perspective on that. It says, "Do not despise the Lord's discipline. Do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those that he loves. As a father, the son he delights in. And I mentioned my daughter earlier on, Millie, and to say she doesn't always appreciate my rules is a fair comment. She doesn't always appreciate the guidance that I give her. She doesn't always fully understand the reason that I ask certain things of her. And I would say most days there is a collision course around that stuff that we have to deal with. But I know that for me, watching her as someone who loves her deeply and as someone who knows at this stage a little bit more than her, I know that every time she has to learn a tough lesson around her behavior, she takes a step forward as a human being. She becomes a better version of herself, even if she can't see it in that moment. So I mustn't strangle my brother, you're saying. Got it? Good. I won't strangle people anymore. And if I don't create the right rails for my daughter to live within, then not only do I fail as a parent, but I set her up to be a deeply unpleasant person. I set her up to be someone who won't have the fullest version of her life, because she will have no friends, and no one will want to spend time with her, and I may never speak to her again. So I have a responsibility to create rails for my daughter to live within so that she can learn from the downsides as well as the upsides of that relationship. And it's the same with God. We need the emotional and the spiritual affirmation when we've got it right. We need to know that God is pleased with us and he's proud on the days when we follow his guidance and we see the fruit of it. That's really important. But almost even more important is we need to feel the pain of when we get it wrong so that we can progress, so that we can learn, so that we can become better versions of ourselves and better disciples. So we can learn how to love people better, to be more patient, to be more understanding, to get it right next time. I'm sure we've all met people in our lives, I know I certainly have, who it was really clear at home when they were younger were never told they did anything wrong. I've met people like this, I've worked with people like this, who just, because their parents only ever told them they were amazing, they actually now just believe it all the time, irrespective of what's going on. And because of that, they are absolutely incapable of ever recognizing they need to personally develop. And man, I don't want to be a Christian like that. I really hope as a church we wouldn't be Christians like that just think we're in the right all the time, that look down on others, that always look for the reason we are correct and someone else has got it wrong. Like, that is so far from the types of people that God has called us to be. And if we don't have the discipline of God, then we don't allow ourselves to progress. And we can't have the discipline of God if there isn't a code of conduct in place that we have aligned ourselves to. And that is where his laws and his guidance add value to our life. As I said at the start, if today is the first time you've heard someone tell you that God loved you so much and desired relationship with you so much that he sent his son to die on a cross for you, that it's the best news you'll ever hear. And I just want to reaffirm that now. It is the absolute best news you will ever hear. And if that's you today, if you're here in this room, if you're listening online and you're thinking, actually, that is the first time anyone's ever said that to me, please don't let a misconception of who God is stop you from getting to know him. Please don't let a cynical worldview dictate whether or not you lean into relationship with that God or not. Maybe you've been on the fringes of church or you've been on the fringes of Christianity for some time, and it's because of this stuff. Maybe you do believe there's a God and you do believe there's somebody there you would love to get to know, but you just can't get over some of the things that are being asked of you in the Bible. I'd love to know Jesus, but there's that thing that I know I've got to do, and it doesn't align with how I want to live my life. And so because of that, I'm not going to press into it. And if that's you today, I just want to encourage you to kind of respond in a few minutes to that. Because I don't believe God expects us to fully understand the reasons that he gives us guidance all the time. I don't believe that's possible. My daughter doesn't understand half the time why I'm asking her to do something that she doesn't want to do. And the chasm between my knowledge and her knowledge is nothing on the chasm between my knowledge and God's knowledge. There's no way he expects us to always have full understanding around why he advises us to live in a certain way. I don't really like paying my taxes, to be honest. But someone much wiser than me has dictated that that's something good for society. And so I will trust that person that I should do that. And I believe we've got to have that sort of trust with God as well, that there might be the odd thing here and there in the Bible that we just kind of struggle with a bit more. It's natural. There's loads in there to be unpacked. And, no one but God has full and complete understanding of his word, of his instructions, of his guidance. But let's not let those small questions stop us from pressing into the big questions, which are, do I need relationship with God? Do I want to know him? Do I want to see his impact on my life? Because when we press into that, we accept that we need counsel and we need guidance from someone so much wiser than ourselves. We start to make decisions that make our lives better and fuller, not worse and weaker. And then we get access not just to the love of God that brings affirmation in the good times, but we receive a discipline that shows us the love of God when we have to learn and when we have to develop. And as always, there's going to be an opportunity for prayer in a few minutes' time, and the band, I wonder if they could just come back up. And like I said earlier, maybe you've just been on the fringes for a while, and today you're really sensing that God is kind of prompting you to respond in a way that you haven't before. Maybe he's prompting you just to lean in to that question in a way that you haven't before, because perhaps just something I've said has challenged your thinking around the type of God he is and why he creates those rails for us to live within. Maybe you're here this morning and actually you're angry at God because of that. Maybe you feel like you've lived in the guilt of not being able to meet the standard for a long time. And maybe that's been eating away at you. Maybe you've actually been too focused on the discipline, not enough on the affirmation of a God who would send his son to die on the cross for you because his love for you was so deep in spite of all of your imperfection. Maybe that's where you are today, and you'd actually just like to chat with someone or pray with someone so they can speak words of hope and truth over your life. And I really felt on my heart that, there's at least somebody here who maybe needs to commit to Jesus for the first time properly this morning. And where that cynical worldview has just been a bit of a blocker up to now. But God is saying, I'm not setting these rules to trip you up. I'm not setting these rules to restrict your life. I'm trying to give you life to the full. As a loving Father who knows so much more, I'm trying to create a safe place for you to live within and thrive within and become the best version of yourself. And so if that's you, I would personally love to pray with you this morning. We have a prayer team that are all wearing lanyards like this. I know that any one of them would love to pray with you, and they'll be available as we sing a song together. But also, if you're here and you came with someone and you just rather turn to them and speak to them, that's totally fine too. I get coming to the front isn't for everybody. It's quite daunting. But if you came here with someone that you trust, or you can see someone across the room that you know and you trust, go talk to them. But just don't leave having not responded. We talk a lot about response at the end of sermons, and it's because the easy thing to do is to walk out the door and forget about it. And convince yourself you're going to do something about it later, and then it never happens. And sometimes just making that decision, I'm going to have that conversation. I'm going to pray with that person. I'm going to do something physical today to confirm that I've been challenged, that I've heard something that has impacted my life. And so don't miss that opportunity if you want to take it this morning. Amen.